Years old, having been born on November 18, 1924. This interview is taking place at Joe Wilson's history classroom at the Rock Creek High School, St. George, Kansas. My name is Billy Brown. I will be the interviewer. Mr. Maskil, could you state for the recording what war and branch of service you served in?
Yes, Billy, I was a merchant seaman. Now, that was not a branch of the service. It was civilian. The Navy is not in the business of moving freight. The Navy is a war machine. They make war. They don't haul freight. So all the equipment, that is 92% of the equipment, 92% of the troops that served in both Pacific and the Atlantic field were transported there. By merchant ships that, in contrast to the Navy, that the merchant ships, the bulk of the ships built, and some of these merchant ships were built, like the Robert Perry, was built in 4 days and 15 hours. That the parts were all assembled otherwise, and it was just a matter of bringing them together and welding them together. Now, this is a picture of Amy Lowell. She's very typical of the merchant ships, the Liberties, that sailed. That she was powered with what we call an up and down engine, that is piston engine by steam. Now, later ships, like the Victories, of which many also were built in the hurry-up manner, that had turbine engines. But the Liberties were very, very slow, that many of them could only make about 8 knots, knots an hour, but somewhat comparable to a mile. And if they could make 10 knots, whereas so they were pretty well setting ducks for Germans, for submarines.
What war did you serve in?
World War II, and also the Korean War.
What was your highest rank?
Able-bodied seaman.
Where did you serve?
Where did I serve?
Yes, sir.
It was during World War II, and of course the Korean War, in the Pacific, but I have made a few trips on the Atlantic, but not during wartime.
What was your life like just before entering the service?
My what?
Your life?
My life? I was a farm boy. Of course, that was days when farmers were more
Mr. Wilson?
or less isolated. That, for example, we didn't have a radio at home, and so on December the 7th, as President Roosevelt called the war the Day of Infamy, when Japan surrendered, we didn't know about it until the next day. No television, no radio.
What was your reaction to being enlisted?
Pardon?
What was your reaction to being enlisted into the...
Well, I wasn't enlisted. See, the Merchant Marine is an all-volunteer outfit. That they were men there from all walks of life. And many of the merchant seamen were older men who would not have been subject to draft, but they wanted to do their part in the war. Several were disabled in some manner, that they couldn't have served in any of the armed forces, but they could serve on merchant ships.
Why did you volunteer?
Why? Well, of course, you kids don't remember Popeye, the sailor man, do you? Okay. See, Popeye was a merchant seaman. And, but then I read a few stories, and I never cared to be in the Navy, but I did want to be a merchant seaman, and I was. So, but the there's a few of us. They were actually merchant seamen were in short supply, or people as willing to serve, because it was the most dangerous of more than any of the armed services. That so, but they had a recruiting office in Kansas City, and I was signed up there and was sent to Catalina Island off the coast of California. There were other training, what they call training schools, St. Petersburg, Florida, and one in New York, Kings Point, I believe. But I went to California. I actually was in training only a couple of weeks, and then sent to San Francisco to, and then was, after a few days, was assigned to the Skagway Victory. That, you have other questions, Billy? Or?
Yes. What was the training camp like?
What was the training camp like?
What did you do there?
What did I do at the training? Well, there's a few lectures. Now, understand, some of them spent months at training camps. That's where I spent only a couple of 3 weeks. But the training camps, like one boy from Westmoreland spent time as baker's school, training to be a baker, because of course on the ship people have to be served food, so he was a baker. That another boy a year behind me in school went to radio school and learned to be a radio operator, and was. But there's very little military about the training school. Oh, they tried. I remember one night they said they was going to teach us to drill. So I got there late, and the captain or whatever ever doing the training said, "All right, you got here late, so you drill by yourself." So he gave me a few orders, and obviously I didn't know what I was doing. Said, "Son," he said, "you don't know what you're doing." He said, "Come stand by me." So I stood by him, and he put everybody else through all the paces to show me how it was done, and I just stood by him. So that's the extent of the military drill that I got.
After that, you went on to your ship. What did you think of your ship?
What did I think of the ship? It was big. The merchant ships, like the Liberties, the Victories, the C2s, of course, there wasn't very, I don't think they built any C2s during the World War II, but they were 410 foot long, you know, a little longer than a football field, and I think about 38, 40 foot wide. And I'm not sure, I can't say how many tons, but, you know, they could haul an awful lot of freight.
What did you do in your spare time?
In spare time? Yes, read that in the 12th century, Samuel Johnson, you may have studied him, and said that anyone who would enjoy being in prison would enjoy being a sailor. That, you know, you're isolated from the world as a seaman. You do have, well, you don't have radio because in those days you're out of touch. So the radio operators did not operate by voice. They operated by diddy-dat, the Morse code. And they got so accustomed to that the radio operator, this wasn't the ship I was on, but the radio operator, and by the way, all of them are called Sparks. Now, isn't that strange? You know, one kid said, the last ship I was on, this radio operator was named Sparks. But the radio operator came down in the mess hall, and somebody said, why don't you get the news, Sparks? And all the time the radio going, did that. Well, he said, the news is on now. You know, to him, he was reading it and couldn't distinguish between the diddy-dat and the spoken voice.
What were some responsibilities you had while you were on the ship?
The possibilities.
Responsibilities.
Responsibilities?
Yes,
Well, on deck, I spent hundreds of hours on the wheel, you know, steering the ship, and of course, chipping paint, or chipping those ships were built of steel, and the salt water made them corrode, so that you take a straight hoe and chip the rust off the decks. That you know, there'd be rust would be an inch deep, and you'd think, boy, you know, one of these days I'm going to go right through. But and painting, but because when you're coming into port, you wanted the ship to look halfway decent.
Were you in any battles while you were out there?
Well, during World War II, I was at the invasion of Okinawa. That was the last major battle with the Japanese, because that was about 400 miles from Japan proper, and so you might call it almost the Japanese homeland. That the actual invasion took place April the 1st, 1945. According to the internet, because I don't have a memory of it, according to the internet, that I was there May the 24th, 6 days before the actual invasion. I was there until June the 30th, 1945. So that'd be April, May, June. I was there 3 months. Now the Okinawa invasion, that was, they were defending their homeland. And in the very early days in history, there's an invading fleet in harbor in Japan and a wind came up, this is in the days of sailing ships, and blew those ships out to sea and ruined the planned invasion. So in Japanese history, that is the divine wind. So as war was drawing near the end of the war, the inspiration of the divine wind caused the formation of Japanese volunteers to the Cosmikaze, I'm not pronouncing that right possibly, but that was the divine wind. These boys would take off with planes with bombs strapped to them. It was a death. Their job then was to crash into an enemy ship in the hope and explode the bomb in the hopes to sink it. That now you might wonder, what kind of people were these that would voluntarily give up their lives for that? Well, actually, there were so many volunteers for that service, to get that privilege, that they had to take only the top of their class. So these boys, these Cosmikaze pilots, were Japan's brightest and the best. I mean, Japan lost hundreds of young men that, had they lived in later years, would have been real leaders of Japan.
Do you remember the invasion of Okinawa?
Do I remember the
Yes,
invasion of Okinawa? Yes. Now, of course, I understand that I'm only an observer. I'm not. You may not get combat veterans to speak as freely as I do because I'm an observer. Now, so the war with Japan, with the invasion of Okinawa, Japan was defending their homeland, and so that it was one of the bloodiest battles of all. And gave us a hint of what it would be if we would actually invade Japan. That these men, these soldiers on Japan, on Okinawa, would fight to the last. Okinawa's honeycombed with caves. They'd be in the caves, and the American forces, the invading forces, would take flamethrowers and burn them alive. This is war. That I might give you more of a taste of what is war. We might go back to Saipan. That on Saipan, the propaganda for we here in America was that the Japanese were little more than trained apes, that they could copy perhaps, but they couldn't create, that they didn't have the mental capacity to create, that and contrary-wise then to the, like for example on Saipan, the natives were convinced that if the island, if they fell into the hands of the Americans, the invading forces, that anything would be preferable. There's a cliff to the north side of Saipan where hundreds of the natives went to that cliff, and families jumped to their death to keep from being captured by the Americans. That death was preferable to what these Americans might do. Another look into a war on Saipan, that in recent years you've read of the mass burials and how we were shocked. On Japan, the dead Japanese were just bulldozed into a ravine and covered up. I mean, mass burial by the hundreds. That then the rains came, and this ravine washed out again. And I have walked down that ravine, and skulls littering the floor of the ravine, leg bones, arm bones sticking out of the sides. You know, this is war.
You said you also served in the Korean conflict, correct?
Yes, that in the Korean conflict, that I had made one trip over there with freight, and then came back, and I was 11 days out of being 26 and above the draft age, and there was a Delta Line ship in, and so what we call a pierhead jump. She was needing a hand right away because she was ready to sail and lacked one person. So it's what they call a pierhead jump, and I threw in for her, and after I got aboard and signed articles, and we took off. Then I found she was leased to Pacific Far East, and back we go to Korea. But my first trip to Korea, the war broke out the last of June, the 1st of July, and I was there in early August, and I found an American army wanting to be beaten. You know, the prevailing attitude was, goody, you know, this is at Busan, goody, you know, we're going to get pushed out of here in 2 weeks. Our commanding general of the Far East was Douglas MacArthur. He had set himself up as a godlike figure in Japan, and when the Korean conflict broke out, about all he had to fight the war with was company clerks. But then, when I went back, then arrived the next trip in early December, and we were loaded with, I don't know, barbed wire and stuff needed for the war effort, but our commanding general was running for president as Custer was at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and as McClellan was during the Civil War. And MacArthur had ordered our Marines up into the Chosin Mountains where they were trapped. And so we had to get them out of there. So Hung Nam got that port open, and every possible ship went to Hung Nam. I was on the Del Alba, and we went up to Hung Nam, but we were loaded, and there wasn't much we could do and didn't, but we were there. But we got the Marines out of there then. It cost the United States 5,000 young men in their prime. And MacArthur said, this was the most satisfactory retreat I have ever been engaged in. That there was quite a number of Korean refugees. See, this is way up in North Korea. It was 10 days then down to Busan. And one ship was not only was loaded with a bunch of refugees, it also put on quite a number of North Korean prisoners. That as I say, it was 10 days down to Busan, and in order to feed the refugees, the steam kettles on the ship were going day and night, cooking rice to feed the refugees. Oh, when we got to Busan, no one had fed the North Koreans, no one had given them any water, and so that when they unloaded them, none of them were able to walk, and they piled the dead up like cordwood on the pier. This is war.
You said you carried barbed wire and stuff like that for supplies for the war. What did you need that stuff for?
Barbed wire?
Yes.
Well, it's not barbed wire as you know it, really. It's a high-tension barbed wire that it uncoils. Well, you know what a slinky is. Okay, a barbed wire then is rolled like that, and you stretch it out, and you don't walk through that stuff. You know, barbed wire entanglement. Its use goes back even to World War I. That is very effective from stopping an advancing troop. You know, you don't jump out of your trench and run through a bunch of barbed wire. That then also we had a deck load. I don't remember which ship that was on, but we had a deck load of well, I remember railroad cars. One of them was a hospital car, a first aid car. But in Korea, at that time at least, it was narrow gauge railroad. Here in America, we had what we call standard gauge. There were and still are a few narrow gauge, but we've gone mostly to standard gauge. But,
What were some of the other loads you had to carry?
what were some of the other ones?
Did you carry troops at any time?
No,
only
I never
material?
was on a troop ship. That I want to say before we do run out of time that I've mentioned the merchant seamen were the most dangerous part, as Dean called it, a service, and that they were less than 250,000, about 243,000 men served as merchant seamen. We lost almost 9,500 men for a ratio of 1 out of every 26 men who served as merchant seamen died. As in comparison, in the Marines, was the highest service, 1 in every 34 casualties. The Navy, 1 in every 114. And Army, of course, in the Army there was more than 11 million served, but in the Army, not take away from anyone, but it takes about 10 men back of the Army to serve the men who are actually in the front lines. That as far as ship losses, now the Atlantic was by far the more dangerous to be in. That the German submarines sank merchant ships within the sight of New York. They sunk them within the sight of the beaches of Florida. There are stories of people that stood on the beach of Florida and could watch burning merchant ships close enough to watch them. The Navy lost in total about nearly 700 craft. But of these, that included infantry landing craft, infantry tank landing crafts that actually were not ships, and PT boats, such as later President Kennedy was a commander of a PT boat. And what he did, had he been in the British Navy, would have been court-martialed for the stupid thing that he did. He crossed the bow of a Japanese ship, and the Japanese ship hit the PT boat and sank it. And Kennedy then he did save some of his men by, he's a strong swimmer, and towed them to shore and saved them. But as I say, in the British Navy, he would have been court-martialed for doing such a stupid thing as running right in front of the boat. And in comparison, so that actually ships lost, including those at Pearl Harbor, there's 2 battleships. They lost 11 carriers, but of actual ships, about 416 that the Navy lost. In comparison to the merchant seamen, lost 1,554 ships. So of the total ships lost during World War II, only a small percentage were Navy ships. The most were merchant ships that such as at Okinawa, we lost, well, we didn't lose, but attacked 30 merchant ships. But the Murmansk run, we still talk about that every reunion, and very few, I've known only a few men who served on that. But that was 85 ships lost trying to get freight to Russia. That most of those, they were sailing close enough, of course, around Germany to get to Russia, that they were constant being bombed. That in Okinawa, where I was, the Hobbs victory and the Logan victory were both sunk on April the 6th by Cosmetazes. And the Hobbs lost 11 crew and 1 armed guard. Well, I hadn't mentioned the armed guard. That was a branch of the Navy that, because as civilians, we merchant seamen couldn't defend ourselves. So they'd put on a Navy crew that were also volunteers that were armed guard. Now, some of those guys may not have known what the armed guard was going to be. They thought, oh boy, armed guard, that'll mean guarding a factory stateside or something. But anyway, the Hobbs lost 11 crew and 1 armed guard, and the Minot Victory, she was only damaged April the 12th, and the Donald McClay was damaged April the 10th, May the 20th by a Cosmetase. On May the 18th, the Cornelius Vanderbilt was bombed and 1 crew lost. May the 24th, the William B. Allison was damaged by a torpedo, 6 crew lost. And on May the 23rd, the Brown Victory was damaged by Cosmetase. Now, the Canada Victory was also sank that when we were stateside and getting our load that for Okinawa, that every place we tied up, they said, oh boy, another victory. That was when the victories were fairly new. And another victory, the last ship that was tied up here was a victory, the Canada Victory. So that was several ports in the United States. Then we went to Saipan, and they said, you're tied up here the same place the Canada Victory was. Then we went to waiting, in Saipan then, the battle for Iwo Jima, one of the big battles, that was where they raised the flag, I think. But anyway, that was February the 19th, 1945. And I was on Saipan at that time, and so we passed around a petition. Everybody signed it, including the captain on down, that feeling ran high at the time. We volunteered to take our ship and use it in any manner that we could. And if failing that, to give us all rifles, and we would do what we could. Well, I signed the thing, but knew darn well they would take us up on it. But they had other plans for us. They didn't know, we didn't know what. So that was when we went then from Saipan to Eniwetok, and they said, boy, you're anchored here just about the same place the Canada Victory was. And then still waiting and not knowing what we were doing, but we were moved to Ulithi, waiting for the Okinawa invasion. Of course, we didn't know. But they said, oh boy, you're anchored here just about the same place the Canada Victory was. So then when we moved on to Okinawa, and it must have been then when we were transferred around to Purple Beach, and we dropped anchor, and they said, boy, the Canada Victory is anchored here about the same place yesterday, but they sank her yesterday. Anyway, the Canada was sank I didn't put the date down. But anyway, the Canada that's been 56 years ago. Oh yeah, she was sunk April the 27th. And 1 crew lost and 2 of the armed guard. And
all of these victory ships had a name like Canada or some other.
The Victory, the Liberty ships were all named after people. Like on the Victories or the Liberties that I've sailed, that I worked on was the Thomas Jefferson, the Walt Whitman, and the Amy Lowell. And somebody said, "What do you do? Pick them by their name?" But and the victory ships were named after cities, like the Skagway, Alaska, and I don't think there's ever a Topeka, but there's merchant ship. The victories were named after, like sailed. I've worked on the St. Petersburg victory, also that named after St. Petersburg, Florida.
Was any ship that you were on ever really attacked by a submarine or by an airplane? Or
No, the closest it came was at Okinawa. That we had put up a smoke screen, that is, had smoke bombs and put the smoke so that the vision was obscured. Well, this one boy, Deputy Cosmetazzi, had come in low and condition yellow from the battleship close by. Condition yellow, fire only if attacked. And we could hear this boy coming in, and the armed guard told the gunnery officer, who was a high school principal from Kentucky, I'm sorry, he's a high school principal from Oklahoma, you know, we're being directly attacked, let's fire at him. The gunnery officer said no, said condition yellow, and all the time we could hear this guy coming in. Condition yellow, fire only if directly attacked. Well, what do you think this is? And about that time, he went over and missed us about 15 foot. And at that same instant, condition red, fire at anything that moves, but he was gone. But also, one night, this boy came in high, and the battleship, and you can't believe the firepower that a battleship has. You know, it just looks like a curtain raising from it, the firepower. That this boy had come in high, and he was diving, and the battleship was and a cruiser nearby were sending up fire, and how he was living through it, I can't imagine. But the high school principal, the armed guard, and the gunnery officer, who was a hillbilly from Tennessee, were up on the bridge, and the hillbilly took a plug of tobacco out of his pocket and took a chaw and handed it over to the high school principal and said, you see that ship up there? The high school principal took a chaw of tobacco and they spit over the side and said, yeah, I said, looks like he's a diving on somebody. Spit over the side, kind of hope it ain't us. But any other questions, Billy?
Kamikaze is, that's suicide.
That's
pilots.
the suicide
Their
pilots.
purpose was to fly their airplane into the ship and die.
Yes.
And they caused a lot of damage. You had several close calls with them, didn't you?
Yes. That was, and see, I think Cosmetazzi is probably translated as divine wind.
I think you're right, sir.
The Navy Guards. Yes, that, now on the merchant seamen were quite comfortably situated. We had a small cabin with 4 bunks and a desk and lockers, whereas the Navy had one large common room with fold-down bunks, and so that to get any space, they would fold up their bunks during the day. And I suppose they were on watch constantly, of course, as the merchant seamen were. So I suppose the ones on watch just had to sleep through whatever was happening. That one of the armed guard had been a professional drummer, so he had brought a pad, a rubber pad, and he would, practice his drumming on this rubber pad.
So how many years were you serving from the time?
How many years?
44 to when did you get out?
Well, actually, 51, but then that wasn't all the same because I was in college in K-State. Should have worn a K-State t-shirt, but I thought this is more appropriate for the day. Well, took me 3.5 years to get through K-State. So, I was always known as the guy that's been in 3 wars trying to keep out of one. Because while I didn't serve during wartime in the Atlantic, that I'd gone down to Chile and we picked up a load of nitrate. The same stuff that they used to blow up the federal building in Oklahoma City. And we had a shipload of it. And so the captain said, look, boys, I know a little bit about chemistry. I know this stuff will explode. I don't know how to make it explode, but I know that it will explode. Everything is there. And we said, okay. He said, if it will explode, where's our $10 a month bonus for carrying explosives? I don't care about that. He said, this stuff will explode. Well, at the time, we didn't know how to make it explode. Then 2 years later, there's a ship loaded at Texas City, and it did blow. And I think it leveled everything for 5 blocks around. It was explosive. But now then, we know how to make it explode. And you just mix it with diesel oil or something, and then set it off with a charge, and it will explode. So they use that now for rock quarries and everything. But at the time, we didn't know how to make it explode. We'd take a handful of it, we'd hit it with a hammer, it wouldn't explode. We'd try to burn it, it wouldn't burn. We tried every way we could think of to try to make the thing explode, but we never thought to mix a little oil in it, and that will set it off. But so we unloaded that nitrate then in France, and so I had the opportunity then. I have ridden the train, express train. She'd do 90 miles an hour from Le Havre to Paris, and I could see the war-torn fields and stuff to the side on the. So I saw not war, but I saw the effects of war there. But then I sailed to Amy Lowell, which here we took a load of trotting. This is another spearhead jump. She was going already headed for out to sea. I cast off and was headed out for sea, and she needed another hand, and so I took her and went to unloaded at Venice, Italy, and I can't remember the name of the town, but we put in one of the towns port towns in Italy, and everything for a mile back from the shore was almost completely demolished. No house had a full roof on it, and people were living there. They had to live somewhere. So they'd patched up those quarters and were living in them. So there again, while I didn't see any actual combat or anything there, I was able to observe the effects of war.
Mr. Maskil, as a merchant seaman, sounds like you would make a trip, round trip with a ship. When you get back into shore, then you voluntarily signed on to another ship, or were you?
Yes, I have a poster that this guy got his sea bag over your shoulder and determined look on his face, and he said, "You bet I'm going back to sea." Now, you mentioned then when we signed off and paid always paid in cash, and then we were on our own. By contrast to the Navy, you know, the Navy would had their clothes furnished. We got room and board, of course, but the Navy had their clothes furnished, and when they were given leave of absence, their pay went right on. In contrast with merchant seamen, once you signed off and got your pay, that was it. You were on your own, no more pay until you signed on another ship.
What did you do after all this ocean going as a,
Well,
when you come back to Kansas then?
a couple of times I came back to Kansas. In '46, I was on the Petersburg Victory then, I think, and there's a general strike and I was at Portland, and I didn't go back to sea, although it seems like I did. That's been years ago, and because we'd put on 1 million board foot of lumber on her, and I have some memory of getting unloaded, so I must have sailed further.
I'm trying to ask what you have done after your service on the sea.
And what I did?
Yeah.
Well,
You're called it.
okay, I went back to college, and then I came back after the Korean conflict, and wrote for a short time for the Kansas City Star, and then had the opportunity to work for Grover's Telegram, which was a livestock newspaper. We covered the markets when Kansas City had a stockyard, and it was a good daily newspaper. It was the only daily newspaper that the Amish or the Mennonites were allowed to read, because never in anything in the Drover's Telegram would disturb their sensitivities.
What else did you do? You were a journalist then?
Hmm?
You were a journalist for the newspaper?
Yes. Then I worked there at Drover's for a few years, and then returned to Westmoreland. My wife's family, her grandfather had bought into the Westmoreland Recorder, the Great Moreland Religious News Weekly, as he always referred to it. Had bought into it in 1885, and so it was still in the newspaper then in the early 50s, when I was working for Drover's Telegram, and then returned to Westmoreland and edited the Westmoreland Recorder for 27 years. Of course, edited, that means you do everything, linotype operator, makeup, whatever. Then we had 2 children, Craig and Debbie, that actually, the weekly newspaper editor is more or less the obituary editor. And so Craig then was the son of obituary editor.
Well, we'll end with that joke, Dr. Maskil. Thank you very much for your
Okay.
coming in to do this interview.
Okay.